Hello, and welcome to today's Tech Talk, Fireside Chat, the evolution of Redshift. Before we get started, I have a few quick housekeeping items. On the left side of your screen, you will see a Q&A pod. Please submit your questions for our presenters and moderators at any time, and we will address them while they come in. At the conclusion of today's presentation, there will be several poll questions during Q&A. Please provide us with your feedback when you see these poll questions appear on your screen. Today's webinar is being recorded. In the next few days, we will send you a follow-up email with the on-demand links to the presentation deck and webinar recording. Again, welcome to today's Fireside Chat, the evolution of Redshift. My name is Ayush Jain, and I will be your host for today's webinar. We were originally going to have Vidya join us today, but unfortunately she couldn't make it because of health issues. So joining us today is Anurag Gupta, VP for Analytics, Aurora and RDS at AWS. Today we'll be discussing how Redshift has evolved since it launched, interesting customer stories, and dive into the product investments that the Redshift team is making today. We'll wrap up by discussing some best practices for migrating to Redshift and building a data lake using the AWS Analytics Services portfolio. Thanks for joining us today, Anurag. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how do you get to AWS, and what does your role at AWS look like?
So I'm basically a data guy. I've been working in the industry for almost 30 years. I've been at AWS for over 7. And when I first got here, they asked me, hey, we want you to go and go disrupt the data warehousing industry and the transaction processing industry. So, small challenge there. And, that the first of those turned into Redshift. The second of those turned into Aurora. And those are the first 2 projects I launched as services, and there have been many others since, but those 2 are very much close to my heart. So looking at Redshift in particular, when we started looking at that space, we saw this interesting thing where the growth of storage, enterprise storage, was far higher, almost 3 times higher than the growth of analytics, analytic data warehousing. And that's kind of interesting. So people are storing data, but they're not analyzing it. And so, that's what we kind of thought about as a dark data problem. So, when we look at problems, areas that we can disrupt, we really look at 2 angles of attack. One is overconsumption, where people are paying a lot more than they should for things that they need, or non-consumption, things where people can't consume something. And so clearly this was a non-consumption problem, right? People are storing data, they're not analyzing it, so why? And so what we came to is that people want to analyze their data, right? But it's too expensive, it's too complicated, and it's too slow when you add more data in. So what we started with, and at that time, you had basically 2 options. There was Hadoop and Hive queries on Hadoop, or there was scale-out data warehousing, which cost almost $100,000 a terabyte list. And so when we came out with Redshift, it was priced at $1,000 per terabyte, so just 1%. So very disruptive from that perspective. And you'd think that, well, why wouldn't people just use Hadoop? And the problem is that the performance isn't really there. So you'd have to really scale out, even if the software was free, you have to scale out your hardware resources a lot more. And it's not just about price, it's not just about performance, it's also about the complexity of just managing your data environments. And Amazon was the first company to launch a managed data warehousing service, and where we took care of backups, we took care of patching, we took care of provisioning your resources, replacing disks when they fail, and all of that becomes increasingly complex as your data sets scale, and you need to process them, in a more operational way.
Makes sense. So you've talked about the dark data problem a little bit when Redshift first started.
Mm-hmm.
But since Redshift was first announced, it has evolved quite a bit.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the journey that the product has been?
Sure. So one of the interesting things that I've seen in this space, and this has been true for a long, long time, is that data grows about 10x every 5 years. And when people are making a analytic platform decision, they want that decision to have a lifetime of about 15 years. And so that's 1,000x. So if you've got a terabyte of data today, you're going to have a petabyte, 15 years from now. If you have a petabyte today, you're going to have an exabyte 15 years from now. So you need platforms that are going to scale along each of these axes, whether it's simplicity, whether it's performance, whether it's just raw scalability, whether it's cost, right? And so those are all areas that we continue to attack with Redshift. I think last year we improved the base performance of the service between 3 and 5x. This year I think we're increasing it another 3x. One of the things I've seen evolving in this space is the rise of data lakes. And that goes beyond data warehousing, right? Because data warehousing has its place, but increasingly I tell people that if you are going to make a platform decision that's going to be long-lived, what you really want is your data to reside in the center, accessible in open data formats by a variety of tools. So, for example, Spark wasn't a real thing 10 years ago. Elasticsearch wasn't a thing 5 years ago. I don't know what's going to be the next big thing 5 years from now. I'm pretty sure it's going to support Parquet or ORC or things like that. And so I think you really want to work with environments that support open data formats and that support open APIs. Even though we have a multitude of services, some of which are homebrew, some of which are open source systems that we manage, all of them support open APIs. Even Redshift has a Postgres interface.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that provides customers with choice and provides them with flexibility. And one of the most important things that I think we did in Redshift over the past couple of years is a area which we call Spectrum, where we allow Redshift to reach out into your S3 data lake and access data. The largest query I've seen anyone process other than in Redshift was over a petabyte of data. The largest query we demonstrated using Spectrum was an exabyte, 1,000 times more.
Wow.
In approximately the same time frame of a couple of minutes. And while hardly anybody has an exabyte of data right now, if trends continue, they will. Yeah. And you just want to make sure you're picking systems that give you the headroom you need.
Absolutely. So talking about that problem, Amazon as a whole probably had a similar issue as well. A few years ago, there was a lot of data, and we were looking for solutions that combine the power of data lake and data warehouse. So how did Amazon adopt Redshift internally?
Yeah, so we at Amazon had the same problem maybe a few years earlier than many of our customers, but it's the same exact problem. We were using a commercial data warehousing vendor. It was super expensive. The hardware was expensive, the disks were expensive, and the software was extraordinarily expensive, right? You probably can imagine who I'm talking about. And that basically meant that we had to be very selective about what we analyzed and how long a period you could analyze it for. And, because either you just couldn't fit the data in or it just took too long. We were typically analyzing a couple of weeks of data, which isn't very much if you think about it, right? Not when you want to think about seasonality and things like that. And so they moved towards Redshift. They run a ton of Redshift clusters for every single aspect of what goes on in consumer, digital, and other aspects of Amazon.com. And in addition, more recently, they've moved towards a data lake at the center, which gives them the opportunity to run systems like Glue to transform data on the way in, Athena for ad hoc analysis, EMR to use the variety of the Hadoop ecosystem capabilities to do custom analyses, and machine learning, SageMaker to do complex models, as well as just Redshift itself to do the bread and butter queries. For example, the flash report that ends up on Jeff Bezos' desk every morning to say how the business did yesterday.
Very cool. So looking outside of Amazon, how have you seen some other organizations adopt Redshift and unlock some interesting use cases?
So, what I think has been really interesting about the evolution of people using data to drive their business is that it used to be that you'd load your data once a week or overnight. Now, about half of the operations on Redshift are insert, update, delete, not selects. So people are micro-batching their operations in because they want to have data recency of, on the order of a minute or less. And so it's one of the few data warehouses that I think can do that. The other thing that I think has become important is that it's become part of people's operational environment. There are companies where their website operates directly against Redshift to surface the dashboards that they provide their customers, that they do their billing against Redshift in order to make their work run, that they do their payments to their drivers using Redshift, because it can just churn through a lot of that data. But there have been cases where if there's been a problem, it really creates an operational issue. So it means that we really need to keep the availability, the durability, the security of our environment far higher, than people would traditionally have constructed for a data warehousing environment, and far closer to what they'd run for, their OLTP systems.
Yeah, makes sense. So Redshift has clearly come a long way, and it's unlocking some interesting use cases. What are your teams thinking of building next?
So, it still comes down to the core things of just making sure that we can improve the service faster than people's data grows, making it less expensive, making it more performant, making it simpler to use, etc. And the simpler to use thing is, I think, particularly important because a lot of our customers don't have DBAs. They don't really want to use, they just want a service that just works. And I think we're increasingly trying to simplify the system to make that possible. One of my favorite features over the last few months is an advisor, which just tells them how to tune their system based on our understanding across tens of thousands of customers. And things of that nature, just so that they don't have to build expertise. Yeah. And eventually that transitions to just making those changes on their behalf in the background. And in general, that's the way we operate. We observe the fleet, we figure out what's best, we provide those as manual suggestions that people can adopt, and then as we gain confidence, we automate those.
Makes sense. So surely there are a lot of pain points around the whole data warehouse, architecture that our team cannot always focus at all times.
Right.
How do you work with some of the partner companies? And can you give us some examples of some interesting partnerships that you've had?
Sure. Yeah. So I think one of the largest partnerships, ecosystems that exists inside AWS is with analytics, both on the ETL side as well as on the business intelligence side, as well as on just consulting practices. And I think that's an important thing to understand. Even if we have our own services in particular areas, we're very happy to partner. At core, we're retailers. Retailers believe in choice, and we want what's right for our customers.
Yeah.
And so there are many BI tools, there are many ETL tools, and they all provide different cuts at what we do best. So for example, AWS Glue is oriented towards developers and makes sure that it removes the undifferentiated heavy lifting of developing Spark jobs that can run. but something like Informatica or Talend are very good at the drag and drop environments of just sort of constructing data pipelines. And both are completely legitimate use cases. But they go after different aspects of the environment. We have other partners that do more of an ELT environment where they do the transformation within Redshift itself, and that's also legitimate.
Makes sense.
And I think probably the area where I'm most excited about partnerships is we have so many customers today who are coming to us and asking to modernize their data warehousing environments where they made a decision 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they're now feeling highly constrained by the cost, the complexity, and the limitations of what data they're able to analyze and what their business is able to do. And so I think we're increasingly working with SIs to systems integrator partners to help them do those migrations.
Makes sense. So let's focus on performance for a bit, since it's one of the most crucial factors for customers to choose a data warehouse service. And as you see more and more lines of businesses adopting the analytics use cases, that becomes even more critical.
Right.
So how's the Redshift team keeping pace with those evolving needs and delivering the performance improvements that you talked about?
So there are a variety of different approaches. Obviously, there are standard benchmarks like TPC-H and TPC-DS. We run those benchmarks. They're relevant to the degree that they're representative of customer workloads, right? And at this point, I believe we are faster than any other cloud data warehouse solution available to our customers. At least those are the numbers I have available to me. More importantly, one of the things we do is that we do fleet-wide scans every week of all the queries run across all of our clusters. And we look at how many take what time, and we basically then figure out what would be most impactful for our next patch. And we release a new database every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And so that part of that's features, part of that's bug fixes, part of that's performance improvements, part of it's simplification. It could be any and all of these things. But one of the things that is most important out of that is just going and figuring out what would be most impactful for our customers based on their actual workloads. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that we run a far higher rate of mutations of data, inserts or commits than traditional data warehouses do. So we've sped up commit processing by about 5x over the past year, and the insert rate by about the same rate. And so I think those are things that wouldn't necessarily be seen in benchmarks, but they're very important to our customer base.
Yeah, makes sense. So you talked about some of the key features that you've launched lately. So you talked about Advisor, for instance, that gives intelligent recommendations to customers based on their usage. What are some other features that have wowed you in the recent past and that customers may still find themselves unaware of?
So, the features I like are the ones that are basically just invisible. So for, that you just use it and the system's better. In fact, I had a recent improvement to query performance where someone called up and said their nighttime jobs ran in two fewer hours and they're worried something was wrong with their cluster. And so those are the stories you like, right?
Yeah.
But I would say the one that I really liked the most was result set caching, which was where like a lot of other databases, we introduced the ability to cache results and run query, so that repetitive runs of a query don't have to hit the database. That improves both throughput as well as response time. And I would say that about half of our queries saw a 10x improvement in their latency. They were already sub-second, but now they're sub 100 millisecond. And that's
Very cool.
And that just makes the their dashboards look so much more responsive.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So shifting gears a little bit, you touched upon this a bit when talking about partnering with system integrators on migrations. And more we are seeing these kind of cases come up when customers actually looking for help and best practices. How should customers think about migrating from an on-premises data warehouse to Redshift?
So I think a lot of this, the devil's in the details, and I would say that we have a lot of different capabilities available. We certainly have, one of the great things about Redshift is that, we have a free trial. You can just spin it up and take it, for a test drive and try it out. You can run your tools against it. Almost certainly the tools you know and love already work. So you're only changing the engine, not all the rest of the data warehousing ecosystem that you've built in your ETL tools and your front-end tools. But then when you have to think about the process of moving things, and there, in general, people want to do, they start off wanting to do a lift and shift, but then they actually realize that what they want to do is actually transition to today's business needs, not what they were doing 5-10 years ago. And those are still relevant, but they want to do a great deal more. And so I think it is worth doing a full-on engineering project to understand what you want to go do, and work with either AWS Consulting or any one of our many partners to do that. And you can reach out to us anytime. Redshift-pm@amazon.com, and we can definitely, based on where you're geographically located and the industry you're in, connect you with a partner who's probably done many implementations in an industry similar to yours.
Makes sense. Cool. So in closing, for attendees who use and love Redshift, what are some of the some tips and recommendations that you would have, not only to get the most out of their Redshift usage, but also to think and expand into other AWS analytics services?
So I would say that one should really start thinking about data lakes, and that will expand the universe of analytic capability available to you, where you can now start associating a portion of your user base that maybe only occasionally needs to run a query, and have them run using Athena. Have people who are doing really fancy analytics or machine learning algorithms and move them to EMR or SageMaker, and have the bread and butter stuff, of course, stay inside Redshift for the fastest performance, the best optimization, and so forth. And that just gives you a flexibility. And I think when you think about this area, you shouldn't really be thinking about individual services. You should be thinking about the analytic platform. And that's really how we view the world. Basically, data at the center in open data formats, security and cataloging around it, a range of data processing engines that provide a range of capabilities for a range of different user personas, and then around that, AI and ML, because AI and ML really require clean data.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks, Anurag. So that concludes our presentation, and we'll move into live Q&A, where we'll take a few questions in the time that we have remaining. Please continue submitting any questions you may have, and we'll try to address as many as we can. We apologize in advance if we do not get to your question. So Anurag, the first question that we have is about real-time streaming analytics. So a customer wants to know how they can enable analyzing real-time data through Redshift.
Now, that's a really important question, and it's increasingly one that our customers are dealing with. So there really are two approaches to it. One is that you can stream data in using Kinesis and analyze the stream using Kinesis Analytics right as it goes on. And that works for a set of use cases. Another one that's pretty popular is people use Kinesis or their system of choice, Kafka, etc., to drop data into S3. And then they may just make it available to Redshift through Spectrum to analyze quickly. Yeah. So that's an interesting thing about the data lake. It can be used not just for very large-scale analytics, but also analytics at right at the point of when data is changing. So And of course, lots of people just load data constantly as well for the 1 to 5 minute lag.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, the next question is, can you talk a little bit about the scale of Redshift in real-world usage scenarios?
Sure. So the largest individual Redshift cluster stores about 10 petabytes of customer data. Now that's Redshift itself without leading off into the data lake, and those are obviously larger yet by an order of magnitude perhaps.
Makes sense. The next question is about resources to get started on Redshift, and I can take that one.
Please, yeah.
So there's a whole lot of resources that can help you get started very easily on Redshift. So if you go on aws.amazon.com/Redshift, you'll find we have a really good getting started guide, which walks you through step by step on how to set up your first cluster. We also give you a 2-month free trial, which means that you can try Redshift without worrying about any cost implications. We also have a POC guide. So if you're doing a proof of concept on Redshift, we enable you to do that by offering some really good recommendations. And you can also reach out to us if you need assistance with your POC. And then finally, we have really easy ways to get started with Redshift. So things like the query editor that just launched, using which you can start querying within your console without even needing a SQL client. So those are some really good resources that you can use to get started quickly and evaluate Redshift.
There are also just some programs like database migration programs and so forth, or the database migration service that lets you transform schemas. And there are a bunch of things that your your account rep can tell you about if you have further questions and a larger, more complex deployment.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for that, Anurag. The last question that we have is about security, and so the customer asks if how do they know that their data is secure in Redshift?
So you can really secure your data from the point at which it's created to the point at which it's backed up. So as you're ingesting it, it can be secured with your keys going into the system using a copy command. It's secure in S3, it's secure in transit, with your customer managed keys going into Redshift. Inside Redshift, of course, all the data can be encrypted at rest, and as it goes out for backups and in logs and in unload commands of queries, it of course is also encrypted, and that's using AES 256 or of course SSL or TLS rather. And there's some interesting things that we do there to make this process efficient. So for example, some of our customers like using hardware security modules like Cloud HSM or even their on-premise HSMs. And so it's at scale when you're running a multi-petabyte system, it's actually fairly hard to rotate your keys, right? And so we do what's known as envelope encryption. I wrote a blog post about it. No, Verna wrote a blog post about it like 5 years ago. And what you do is that the data goes out, it's encrypted with a cluster key, and then it's encrypted on the cluster key it's encrypted with a block key. The block key is encrypted with a cluster key, and the cluster key is encrypted with your own private key if you want. And that means that unless we get access to your key, we can't decrypt, and also your backup can't be restored onto a different cluster without access to that cluster key. Yeah. And since the blocks themselves are each independently encrypted, you can't go and store data into one table that you want, and if you had access, go and drop that content into some other table. So those are all different ways that we've really looked at every single possible way someone can possibly mutate the database or look at it, and ensure that they can't do that even across backups and restores.
Makes sense. Cool. Thank you, Anurag. I think this was very insightful. We hope that you got a lot out of this conversation, and we'll continue sending our way more questions that you may have in the future. Thanks for joining us. With that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. Again, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Anurag for his time and a great presentation. If you have any comments on our previous and upcoming webinars or suggestions on the topics you wish AWS may cover in future webinars, please feel free to email to aws-webcasts@amazon.com. And once again, to reiterate, Anurag, if you have any questions about Redshift, you can email redshift-pm@amazon.com, as well as check out aws.amazon.com/redshift. Your feedback will help us improve our webinar programming. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and please enjoy the rest of your day.